Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Global Fleet Conference 2020. Welcome to this webinar, Benchmark Your Strategy, Key Lessons from the Global Fleet Survey 2020. Of course, our Global Fleet Conference is made possible thanks to our sponsors, and today we are going to deep dive into one of the most important topics for your global fleet management. Indeed, you need from time to time to benchmark your strategy. It's important that you know where you are in terms of your fleet development and also compare your own strategy with that of your peers. So this is why we have decided to give you already a first insight into the highlights, the key results of our Global Fleet Survey 2020 that we conducted this year for the 5th time and that we organized from the beginning of February until May. And it's a survey in which we had in total more than 60 questions, and there the global and international fleet managers could respond so that we can see what their corporate buying and strategy intentions are. And today we have invited some experts to discuss with us the most important findings, key results, a first flavor, let's say, of the Global Fleet Survey 2020. It's my pleasure to introduce to you today Sven Van Rossum. He is Head of Innovation at Global Fleet. Then we have two global fleet managers, because it's always interesting if we present some findings of a global fleet survey with global fleet managers, that we also have some customers, of course, that can reflect on those results. And so today we have Yulia Lapenkova of Danone and Gavin Harvey of Sodexo among us. And then we invited also our sponsors, and today we have two of our sponsors of the Global Fleet Survey that are present, and that is Yves Helven of Connector and Jarvis of Geotab. So they will, together with me, try to detail what the highlights are of this year's Global Fleet Survey 2020. And at the end, we have a special, let's say, promotion for you. So please wait until the end, because there is a nice surprise for the Global Fleet Conference participants. So without any further ado, let's kick off. And I think it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Sven Van Rossum, Head of Innovation at Nexus Communication and Global Fleet, who has conducted the slides of this webinar with the key results of this year's survey. And of course, we are curious to see what those results are. Sven, how are you doing?
Hey, Steven, I'm doing fine. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me, of course. I think let's jump right into this year's survey results. And I'd like to do that by providing a bit of an overview of the profiles of the respondents and the companies they work for. So we can definitely say that again, also this year, the Global Fleet Survey has been a huge success. We've had 113 respondents, so representing large international or multinational companies. They represent approximately 1 million units, of which almost 900,000 cars, so passenger cars, and 177,000 LCVs. And they also employ, or at least the companies that they represent, they employ more than 8 million employees, almost 8.5 million employees. So I think that the scope of the survey, and that's just to give you an indication, can already give you quite some insights, or at least in what the general feel of the global fleet community is thinking. If we talk about the headquarters, first slide. What we see, and that's pretty similar to previous years, is that of course the majority of the headquarters of the companies that they represent are based either in North America or in Europe. The biggest country, or let's say the top 3 countries, being the USA, Switzerland, and France. The USA represents 42% of all headquarters of all the fleets that have participated. Switzerland coming in nicely on the 2nd place, Switzerland, that makes sense, obviously. I think most of you are aware from a taxation perspective that in Europe, Switzerland is home to a lot of headquarters of a lot of multinational companies. And then thirdly, France with 8%. What you also see is that from the participation that we had, that indeed the majority of those companies from North America and Europe, only a smaller part effectively have a headquarters that is based in Asia Pacific or in Latin America. Africa, Middle East, there was actually one participant in there, but of course that represents only a very, very small part of the headquarters. If you can go to the next slide, Celine. All right. The average fleet that the companies or the participants that have conducted or at least participated in the survey, the average fleet is approximately 9,400 vehicles. Those 9,400, if I compare that to 2019, we see well, somewhat of a significant drop coming from approximately 11,000 vehicles to 9,400. Of course, that is also a little bit dependent on which companies are effectively participating in the survey. It might be that there might have been a couple of different companies participating last year in comparison to this year. But ultimately, we ended up with an average fleet of 9,373 vehicles. If you look at the employees, those companies represent approximately 75,000 employees each, which means, and that makes sense, that if you look at the fleet and the employees, that they have approximately 13% of car to staff ratio, if we can call it like that, which is actually pretty normal when we look at most companies within our community. If we look a little bit more in detail at those 9,400 cars, we see that the majority of the fleet is based in Europe. So with a share of almost 5,000 units. I think most of us here know that, of course, in Europe, per cars are probably the penetration of per cars is probably a little bit higher than in other parts of the world. That's mainly due because of taxation and legislation, obviously. So that also explains the fact that Europe is really well represented when it comes to fleet size. Secondly comes in North America with approximately 2,000 cars, which are more duty cars. And then Latin America, Asia Pacific, approximately the same size when we look at global fleets. And Africa, Middle East ending up at around 400 units. Yes, Celine? If you look at the following slide, that's actually representing a little bit the different industries in which our participants are working, so the companies that they work for. Interesting here, and that's a big difference in comparison to last year, is that almost 50%, so this is the top 5, almost 50% work either in pharma or health, and IT or technology, which is a lot of companies that have participated in the survey are actually pharmaceuticals effectively. Thirdly, at around 10% are fast-moving consumer goods, so retail or supermarkets, those kind of companies. Then fourthly, we have engineering, and finally at 6% we have chemical and petroleum.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you already for this first insight, Sven. I think indeed that it's great that you see that this is really a representative sample of the global fleet management industry. I think that last year we had 107 respondents, this year 113. So there is still indeed also from the community the need, let's say, to see how their fleet management can be benchmarked with the peers and with other companies. So it's perhaps good that we now also ask already a few questions to our global fleet managers in this webinar. Hello, Yulia. Hello,
Hi.
Gavin. Hello. And I would like to start with Yulia. Yulia, can you a little bit describe the size of your fleet? So you are global, the procurement manager at Danone. What is the size of your fleet? What is the region where you have the most cars? Can you a little bit detail this?
Yeah, sure. In Danone globally, we do cover around 14,000 cars. 60% of the cars are allocated indeed in European region, and 40% is spread across the world, where the majority of the cars is in LATAM, CIS, and Asian Pacific regions. So this is how we, this is how we present it in the world.
Okay, and if you look now a little bit at, let's say, the composition of your fleet, do you also have, I imagine, with Europe, your biggest fleet, that there is also, and the per cars or the benefit cars, and then more the tool cars, the duty cars, you have also that split that is present in your fleet?
Yeah, it's always like that. So speaking about 14,000 cars, it includes, of course, both benefit or per cars and also commercial fleet. And it differs from country to country, actually, right? In the headquarter country, France, obviously, we do have more benefit cars, which is 30% out of the entire fleet. But average split would be 20% of benefit cars and 80% of commercial fleet. That's how we structured.
Okay, very good. Then we are now going to Gavin Harvey of Sodexo. Gavin, also to you, good afternoon. And the same question. So can you a little bit tell us about your fleet size and the way, let's say, that the fleet is split around the regions?
So we also have we have a large 12,000 vehicles, so a bit more than the average you have in your survey. It's split between cars and commercials, roughly 50-50. But that really does vary by country. So very much, say, Belgium, very much per cars. The UK, people taking cash rather than company cars. And the US, as you alluded to earlier on, Sven, is that very much there. It's not cars, it's commercial vehicles. Mm-hmm. So the split does vary from country to country. In terms of geographical splits, Europe does dominate. It's about just over half our vehicle fleets.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Gavin, do you see, for example, over the past few years that there is somehow an evolution, a movement, let's say, where you operate your fleet? For example, is Europe, the fleet size, perhaps a little bit decreasing while other regions are perhaps increasing, or is this not the case?
For us, it's a direct correlation between the growth in the country. So if our clients are growing, then we grow. And we've seen more growth in perhaps say Latin America than we have in Europe recently. So that's where we're seeing a slight increase in size of fleets.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Yulia, for you, do you also forecast, for example, we have seen that last year in the survey, the average fleet size was a bit bigger than this year. Do you also see for your fleet, perhaps in the upcoming years, that there might be a decrease of your fleet size?
Yeah, that definitely can be. I would say that Danone case is quite unique in this sense because end of last year we also started shifting from one car manufacturer to new partners. So, and that actually made us do a very interesting exercise in each country to revise our needs, to revise our fleet while replacing our current fleet to the new models. And on the one hand, it was quite a challenging exercise. On the other hand, it made us actually to reflect a little bit on our needs. And now we have clear car catalogs in each country, and in many countries, mainly in Europe, that's true. We also decided to go for cash allowance only instead of benefit cars because we also see that trend that people go more for cash allowance. And in some countries like France, for example, or the Netherlands or Belgium, we see a very good starting trend on mobility solutions, so that HR starts thinking on flexible benefits where mobility should be a part of it. So that's also the reason why we see that the fleet in the nearest future would be decreasing.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like now to hand over again to Sven Van Rossum for the second part of the key results, and you see it on your screen there. He is going to talk a little bit more about the globalization aspect of global fleet management.
Correct. Thank you, Stephen. I think in this part, we want to showcase a little bit, okay, what are the reasons or the obstacles or the challenges that our global fleet managers community are confronted with when they are going global. And the first question we asked is, are you already managing your fleet or your mobility strategy on a global level? And interesting there is that 72% of those multinationals are indeed saying, yes, we already have a global strategy in place. And another 20% or 19% is saying, not yet, but we do intend to do so in the coming years. So we clearly see that as it has been going on for the last couple of years, that more and more of those multinational companies, the ones that haven't done it yet, they are definitely looking in or towards the direction of global fleet management. Go to the next slide. Yeah. Another question, of course, was to find out that the global fleet strategy, so the international strategy that has been laid out, under which business department does that strategy fall, or where does it sit? Unsurprisingly, of course, 63% of the respondents said, okay, well, this global fleet management lays within our procurement department. That makes sense. That's also pretty similar to what we've seen last year. Same for the number 2 and 3 spot, being HR and fleet, so a dedicated fleet business department on a global level, representing respectively 27% and 21%. What we also see is an increase, slightly, but nevertheless an increase in mobility and travel. So we see that travel is slightly growing, the same with mobility, when it comes to having the responsibility over fleet and mobility. I think mobility is a little bit of a new name for the department, and it's probably coming across from, let's say, the old, let's say, fleet departments that have changed name and are looking a little bit more wider towards broader mobility. But we do see that there is a small increase coming from that perspective. And then finance, which is also a little bit of a newcomer in comparison to last year, is at 16%. I think that is mainly due because of the differences in companies that are responding to this survey. So again, as I mentioned earlier, last year probably there might have been some other companies that have responded in comparison to this year. An interesting one, and we're trying to detail a little bit here, is okay, what kind of strategy or what details of the strategy is being handled on a global level, regional level, and national level. So I've selected the top 3 here of the responses that we received. On a global level, what is clear is that the global strategy defines the lease company preference. So there's probably the tenders for a leasing company is being done on a global level. We'll go into that a little bit later, what the reasoning behind that is. But of course, as you can imagine, pricing and price alignment is of great importance. CO2 targets also set on a global level. So the CO2 caps that will probably be applicable both on a regional and national level are being set globally. And for me, at least a little bit surprising, was the reporting tool choice. Again, I will come up to that a little bit later, but one of the key items, and I can already tell you that came out of the survey was that a lot of the global fleet managers are considering the complexity of getting the right data, transparent data coming in is one of the biggest challenges that they're having on a global level. And that's probably also why more and more companies are making the choice of setting the reporting tool at a global level to make sure that they can integrate all the data in a good manner. At a regional level, what's interesting there is that both car brands and financing methods are selected regionally. So that's the regional strategy who decides that. I think that also makes sense because, as you can imagine, in the US or North America, we'll probably see different cars on the road than we see in Europe because of taxation legislation. So I think brand selection, OEM selection is still pretty regional. The same from a finance method. Taxation legislation can define that, okay, perhaps full operational lease might not be the answer in country X, and perhaps there we need to look at financial leasing or something like that. A little bit surprising for me was the safety targets. But again, if we start thinking about that, we can also imagine that there are different safety needs looking at Latin America than looking at Europe. So I can also see there a little bit of a reflection. Okay, let's take that to a regional strategy. national or locally, that is pretty similar, and that's very practical as well. The fuel supplier choice is of course very dependent on the coverage that is available within your country. You could have a specific fuel supplier, but if you select that internationally and it's not available in, let's say, Germany, then of course that doesn't make sense. So I think that's a clear local choice. The same from car eligibility. I think here you would see that in certain countries it is more common to provide per cars, as Julia also mentioned earlier, that you would have a per car for a sales employee, while in other countries that might not be as common, and it might be more cash, or it might be more other advantages that they be provided with. And also driver management rules. I think that is a very specific item in which companies, well, they have to look at it from a local level, because it's if you would have to do that on a global level and really look in, okay, is driver X, Y, or Z adhering to all the rules that we've set forward in the car policy? I think that makes sense that you would do that locally. Yes. This is a specific slide I wanted to share. We've asked a question to the community in simply asking, is there a cost savings target that you have in place for fleet and mobility? 66%, so 2/3 of the companies mentioned indeed, yes, we do have a cost savings target in place. And the average savings target that they have year on year on fleet and mobility is 7%. That is the average. There were some real extreme points at around 17% even, but this is an important one, because this also shows that, and we'll get into that in a later slide. But this also shows that the fleet and mobility community, they're trying to find those cost savings from, of course, things like supplier harmonization, from economies of scale. So that again shows that cost savings are, of course, also driving a little bit the reasoning of going global. And that is where we end up right now. So if we look at the top 5 reasons on why fleets are going global, from scale from 1 to 5, actually, the rating that they gave, you can see that the first 4, the highest 4, are all related to costs. Whether it's cost savings by economies of scale, which is of course the most immediate thing where you think about when you try to consolidate your fleet on a global level towards your suppliers, but also increased cost control, supplier management, and process harmonization. I think increased cost control, really indeed looking at where can we save costs if we work with less suppliers, for example, but also process harmonization is a little bit looking into the simple fact of tendering. If you would have to do a tender on a local level, regional level, or global level for certain suppliers like leasing, I think it makes sense that you can harmonize where possible and try to implement that as good as possible. The 5th reason was best practice sharing, which is not directly related to cost. It could, of course, but it's more about, okay, if we are something that we're doing for our fleet in, let's say, a very mature country like in the Netherlands, perhaps we can learn something about that and we can implement that across other parts of the world as well. If you look at the obstacles, and that's what I mentioned earlier as well. So the obstacles for going global, that was very clear that the first thing that came in was the complexity of processes. I can imagine that if a fleet or mobility manager goes global for the first time, it must be tremendously hard, and perhaps my colleague speakers can answer that as well. But I think it must be incredibly hard to find your way amongst the different processes that are in place today on a local or on a regional level within your company. You have to consolidate all that. You have to bring that all together and try to find alignment and harmonization in setting up a new, let's say, global strategy. And I think that is the reason why that is definite number 1 in obstacles of going global. Number 2, the lack of transparent data. Again, referring to the reporting tool that I mentioned earlier that came out from a global level. I think data is key, obviously, in both in cost savings, in driver management, in everything that you do. So transparent data. If you have a fleet of 15,000 cars in 20, 30 countries, I think it's crucial that you know which cars are where. Are they being utilized the way it should be utilized, or can we get rid of them or not? I think so. Transparent data is key in everything that you do. Number 3 and 4 are more external obstacles, lack of supply information and lack of a global leasing offer. That's something that keeps on returning in the survey as well, is specifically the global leasing offer. I think most of, let's say, the big 5 leasing companies do have a global leasing offer, either directly themselves or with a partner, but there are still certain countries or certain regions that are underrepresented. And that is something that keeps on returning as an obstacle of really managing your fleet on a global level. If there are global alliances that are working together across different regions, it might be also, or at least the fear exists, that it will be impossible to get the 2 data sets together and things like that to make sure that that's all available. So that is still a question that pops up from the global fleet community. And then finally, another internal one, which is the lack of sponsorship of the stakeholders. Also a very common obstacle, but a very important one. I think whether we are talking about cars or whether we are talking about printers, let's say it like that, I think you need to have that senior management support in order to make sure that the regions will adhere and comply towards the strategy that is being set at the headquarters. So that is and remains crucial.
Okay, thank you very much. Nice figures, good insights, a lot of information. So let's have a discussion with our 4 invitees, Yulia, Gavin, Yves, and Aaron, and also Sven. Of course, you can be part of the discussion. I would like to start, if possible, again with Yulia and Gavin. First of all, Yulia, do you consider your strategy a global strategy?
Definitely. We do have a global strategy, and end of last year we finalized the revision of the strategy and we got it approved. So it's totally a global strategy.
Okay, why did you go global?
That's the best way, not only to be able to monitor the entire fleet of the company, because big things you can see from big distance, let's put it that way, but also to set up a nice service level, and also to make sure that all the countries go for mandatory things which are important for the companies, such as preferred supplier, which is negotiated globally, car manufacturer, also pre-selected preferred suppliers of leasing companies, also the sourcing approach, which generate the cost savings, but also the reporting tool, as you said, Sven. So it was quite surprising for you, but for me it's also surprising that many companies do not have that global reporting tool, because basically that's the key success element to be able to track and monitor the entire fleet. And also the brand new clause for us would be in the global car policy and in our strategy is the sustainability clause. So basically we want to set the targets, the CO2 targets.
Okay, perfect. Gavin, we saw in the figures that were presented by Sven, or in the elements that were presented, that the things, let's say, that the respondents indicated as those are the elements that are steered, managed on a global level, were CO2, the leasing vendor, and the reporting tool. Are those also elements that you steer or try to steer on a global level?
Yes, very much so. There's one thing where we differ to that slide is that we have global and then we have country. What we don't have in the middle is regional. And therefore something like manufacturer tender that I manage at global level rather than leaving it to the country. Otherwise, very basic. I think there are huge opportunities to save money by doing a leasing tender at a global level and a manufacturer tender at a global level.
Mm-hmm. And why don't you have the regional level? Is that historically in your company, or is that, let's say, a decision that was taken?
It's a resource issue. We're a low margin organisation, and we try and keep our overheads very low. And so I am the global buyer looking after travel and vehicles, and we don't have a regional resource. It does create a challenge. And the way around that I found is when I do my leasing tender, I also negotiate some complementary consultancy. And I find the consultants within the leases are very, very capable in providing extra resource to assist me in my goals.
Okay. Yves Helven of Connector, you saw also the three elements that were the top three elements that are steered on a global level: CO2, leasing, reporting. There are some other elements that were presented more on a regional level and on a national level. Do you think that perhaps some of the elements that were not mentioned on a global level could perhaps also be managed globally? Are there elements outside of CO2, leasing and reporting where you say this is perhaps something that global fleet managers could look at in the near future to also steer on a global level?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Stephen. I think that the answer comes also from the fact that we have a large population of procurement fleet managers who responded to the survey. So when we talk about strategy on global level, it's very often a procurement strategy on global level, and makes complete sense there. When you make a mix, let's say if you would make an equal mix between procurement, HR, general management, facilities, and so on, the thing that you would find on top on your global level would be more like the corporate strategies, right? The strategies that go way beyond the car, but that influence the way a company works. And on those levels, I think that we recognize sustainability as one of the elements that we find both in procurement and in fleet and so on, and on a corporate level. One of the things that I missed in the survey, and that might be an answer to your question, is digitization. Digitization of workspace, digitization of business processes, and so on and so on. I would have expected that we would see more about digital versus analog on that particular top level.
Okay, let's go back then to Gavin Harvey. What do you have to say to the comment of Yves Helven of Connector about digitization is lacking? How do you deal with digitization?
Could you just clarify the question? You say digitalization. What are you actually referring to precisely?
Well, I think yes, Yves.
Yeah, I can quickly answer. Let's look at the car fleet, right? What I call analog models is what we're doing today, and from a business process on a business process level, it is the way that vehicles are managed, the way that our suppliers manage the cars on our behalf, and so on. There's still a lot of analog work. This is one thing. Second thing is, and this is a COVID result, working from home, working digitally versus working from the office. Right. Also, a certain level of digitization that is entering the way we as employees, because we are also employees, the way we operate. As an overall thing, and whether we look at the pharmaceutical industry or the FMCG or companies like your own, Kevin, like Sodexo, the entire business is becoming much more digital, which has implications on, for instance, the number of kilometers that your employees are doing. Right. So what we see on the corporate level is that there's a strong push for digitization, but I don't see that necessarily reflect into or translated into fleet strategies, at least not in the responses of the survey.
I don't think that wasn't really a direct question within the survey, but what I can see within Sodexo in terms of utilization of the fleet, post-COVID, I can imagine people will be driving their vehicles far more and avoiding public transport. So yes, they will be using, like we're using now, rather we aren't meeting face-to-face like we normally would have been. So digital does work, but there will be a counter side to that as well. People will be wanting to use their vehicles more when they're not working at home.
Okay, thank you. A question for Aaron. Aaron, also for you. We saw, for example, we know Geotab technology connectivity, safety, and so on. And we saw that safety is not managed on the global level. Now, I can't imagine that there is a multinational company that says that safety is not paramount. Are you surprised by the fact that safety is not one of the topics that is in the top of the elements that is steered or managed on a global level?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, because I think coming back to Yves' point around, you know, the people that were surveyed and, you know, the interests of, let's say, the procurement department, I think when it's the procurement department setting a global strategy, you're, you know, clearly going to be based around return on investment there. But we certainly see across the fleets that we work with a growing emphasis on safety and on first notification of loss, and to understand how we can reduce risk. And that also clearly has implications onto the procurement side, because reducing risk ultimately reduces the cost of, you know, maintenance of a fleet. So yeah, I was certainly surprised to see that it wasn't higher up in the list, but, you know, based on who was surveyed and the sort of respondents that we have, it's expected, I think.
Okay, another question for you. We also saw that one of the obstacles is that processes are too complex. What is your answer, as you are a supplier, a business partner of fleet managers? What is your answer to the fact that apparently your processes are too complex for them?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair point. And we work hard, you know, every day to simplify the processes for our partners. And I think this is part of our strategy, is to build a global ecosystem to support, you know, our whole network. And you know, that leads nicely back into some of the problems that you highlighted in earlier slides. So, for example, you know, a global procurement deal for vehicles might not cover a certain territory. And similarly with telematics or any other element of procurement, generally it's very difficult, you know, if you're managing a fleet across 40 countries, to make sure you can cover each one. Our strategy, and you know, we advise that the whole network looks for partners that can fill those gaps. So we partner with OEMs and leasing companies and fleet management companies all over the world to make sure that we can help our customers fill those gaps. So, you know, if a large multinational fleet is struggling with short-term delivery of electric vehicles in the UK, we will have a partner that's well placed to help fill that for them. So it's really being an ecosystem where we can step outside of our role. So as a telematics company, can we help you with your vehicle acquisition? Can we help you fill a gap?
Okay. One of the elements that is also steered on a global level is CO2, but I can imagine, of course, that CO2 is not one of the elements that is, let's say, as transparent in each and every region and every country, and that probably not even every country is using the element of CO2. So I would like to go now first to the global fleet managers. So Yulia, can you tell us a little bit how you deal with, let's say, emissions, for example? Is there a CO2 cap, and how do you align that then on a global level, regional? How do you match that?
And that's a very good question. That's one of the most challenging points we are facing now. So basically, when we go from the global policy, we always go for the global mission of the company, because we also have those commitments to the non-commercial organizations, where we have the overall commitment by how much we want to reduce our CO2 by 2030 or 2025. And there is a dedicated team within the company which is tracking our CO2 emissions footprint, coming not only from fleet, but also from travel, from our suppliers, from factories, etc. And fleet is going to be less than 10% of impact within the total CO2, but nevertheless we want and we will contribute in that sense. So therefore, we first of all, on the global level, we are aligned with our overall mission. So what to reduce our fleet, our CO2, and then we go to the countries, because we need, of course, localize it. I mean, that's a global approach with local execution. And now what we are doing in order to make it smart, we took two samples. Basically, we took France and Russia, two completely different countries, and we see the potential based on our car manufacturers, what we can do in terms of the tools, let's put it that way, the availability of the electric cars, hybrids, what would be the impact on the TCO. And then the next step would be to go how we want to develop the mobility solutions in there. So once we are done with that exercise, we will see how we can roll out it to other countries. That's the approach we are taking now.
Okay, you were already talking about electric vehicles. Of the final chapter of this webinar, in which Sven Van Rossum will detail a little bit what the line is of global fleet managers regarding trends and developments. Sven.
Indeed, thank you, Stephen. I just wanted to use the following slides a little bit to outline some of the external factors which we also questioned towards our community. First slide I want to highlight are the criteria to select a car brand or car manufacturer or OEM. Unsurprisingly, at number one with 4.4 out of a scale of 5 is pricing. Pricing, of course, plays an important role in everything that we do, and definitely, as mentioned before, if you look at 66% of our audience that participate is coming from a procurement perspective, then it makes absolute sense that pricing is on top of the list. If we look a little bit further, we see safety and technology. So indeed, safety and safety technology is obviously important for our audience. And then looking a little bit further, I think it's all a little bit more around emission strategy, around CO2, around the different powertrains that are available. Just coming in that, and perhaps we can go already to the following slide. If I give a little bit more detail around the green fleet, can we go to the? Yeah, merci. So if I look at some of the responses asked to the audience, specifically around diesel and EV share in their fleet, it's clear there that if you look at diesel, for example, 80% of the audience of the respondents expect their diesel share in their fleet to decrease. Not a big surprise there. Definitely also not if 50% of the audience is coming out of Europe, where we see a significant decrease happening over the last years. So 80% expect a decrease in diesel, while on the other hand, 83% expect a significant increase in electric vehicles in their fleet. Also not surprisingly, but if you go a little bit more in detail and if you look at the numbers that are behind there, is that the audience that we questioned said that on average today they have approximately 3% EVs in their fleet. And I think that's a pretty similar number across most bigger fleets across the world. The expectation is by 2025 to get that number up to 33%. So the 113 respondents that we have that are representing 1 million vehicles today expect that by 2025, approximately 300,000 of those million vehicles are electric vehicles in their fleets. So that's in 5 years' time. So you definitely see an increase there. So also there, the criteria to select the right OEM within your strategy, of course, it makes sense that EV and emission strategy plays an important role. If we look at the criteria to select the right leasing supplier for our audience, you can see again that the first two are pretty much related to cost, but not cost as in purely on pricing, but also cost as in transparency of cost. We still see today, after many years, that leasing companies are still questioned about their transparency when we're talking about residual values, when we're talking about maintenance budgets, insurance components, and things like that. So cost transparency is still very important for our community in order to make the decision for their lease supplier. On third setting, we see multi-brand capabilities. That comes back a little bit to the reasons to go global. If they're looking at further alignment across the countries, if they're looking at process harmonization, they're most likely also looking at less suppliers, which makes sense. And less suppliers, meaning that the suppliers that they do have will need to be able to offer, at a minimum, multi-makes, multi-brands. So that is definitely one of the biggest requirements to select a lease supplier. And then finally, that's a little bit more soft, but still important. Global account team and global coverage. As mentioned earlier, that global coverage remains a valid point to select your leasing supplier, but also your global account team. The people that, of course, that have responded into the survey all have a global role, so they need to have somebody at their level that they can talk to as well in order to make sure that not only during the tender phase, but also afterwards when working on certain fuel programs or things like that, that they can have somebody within their leasing company to work with them together on those topics. Just to pinpoint out as well from a leasing supplier perspective is that, and I do find that interesting, is that if we ask the community in which countries do you expect to change your leasing supplier in the coming 12 months? And the 3 countries that came out on top were Germany, Belgium, and France, with pretty similar numbers. So 16% of the audience expect to change their lease supplier in Germany. What for me is interesting there, if I try to analyze those numbers a little bit, is that 16% of the audience says that Germany is probably a very mature market. So I'm presuming that one of the reasoning behind it is also from a competitiveness perspective. So if those markets, if you look at Germany, Belgium, France, they're pretty mature, pretty competitive. So I can imagine there, it's also easier to change supplier, and there's also probably more incentive to change supplier if you have a competitive market. If, of course, we're talking about markets where, let's say, the international suppliers or the general suppliers are not available, then there's probably less appetite to change supplier because they're used to the product and the services that they can get from their main international suppliers. Yes, we go to the next slide. Then we get to telematics. Interesting there is that 22% of the respondents says that they have some kind of a telematics or connectivity solution today in their fleet or part of their fleet around the world. If the question is asked, okay, will you be integrating telematic solutions in the future? Then we get to 81% saying that in the next 3 years, we expect a telematic solution to pump into my fleet. That is an interesting one. That's also aligned to what we saw last year. For me, the biggest differences there is that if we look, and we don't have a slide on that, but if we look at the detail is that in the previous years, they expect a lot of the telematic solutions to come in via the leasing supplier or via the manufacturer. And we see for the first time this year a real change in that, and where they actually expect the telematic solution to come from a telematics provider, a real expert on the matter. And probably that's also coming from the fact that data is becoming more important, and that telematics partner that we're working on that particular segment can provide better insights, or at least can assist and advise better on what to do with the data that comes out of your fleet. So that's the biggest difference that we saw towards last year when talking about telematics. And I think those are the slides I wanted to share today, if I'm right. Yes.
Okay.
So Stephen, back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sven. Thank you for highlighting the key results. Of course, there are many more results that we can bring to you. A word on that after our final round with our experts. And also you can participate. You can send your question via the chat function of the webinar tool. And so we will have some Q&A together with our experts. The first questions are already popping in. Of course, related to, I think, the first slide that Sven presented in terms of car manufacturers and then also EVs. Gavin, are you also going to multiply, let's say, your EVs in your fleet by a ratio of, let's say, 10?
I don't think it's a binary choice between moving from diesel to electric, because there's an interim as well, which is hybrid. And I think what we're going to see is a large increase in standard hybrid and plug-in hybrids over the next few years. It's far easier for us to implement than it is for electric vehicles. And also country, there will be variances by country, but I do think it would be the hybrids where you can see the real increase in rather than electric initially.
Okay, Yulia, how do you see your powertrain mix, both ICE with diesel and petrol, and then hybrid and electric vehicles on the other side evolve?
For today, we do not have so many electric vehicles and hybrids. We also foresee to have the fleet transition. We do not have yet a clear roadmap, let's put it that way. But electric, so mainly speaking about Europe, right? Because there is Europe and there is rest of the world where it's not really a big trend or opportunity. And there we see a clear tendency to go for electric vehicles and hybrids as well, with one watch out for hybrids, because it should be really clearly limited by the car policy, local car policy in terms of usage. Otherwise, you will have a very dramatic impact on your TCO in terms of fuel usage.
Okay, short question for you, Yulia, and then also Gavin can respond. Came in just now. Are you also using telematics already or not?
In some countries, yes. In some countries, yes, but it's not a global initiative. It's rather a local initiative.
Okay, and you, Gavin?
My answer is exactly the same. It's not a global initiative. We're looking at various countries. We have implemented in some countries. We haven't always been successful. There's an issue to do with change management and also allocating resource to utilize the reporting.
Okay, then the question to Aaron, how easy is it to, let's say, implement, let's say, one telematics solution across multiple regions?
Good question. I would say that it's always a challenge, like any global rollout of a solution. But the choice of your partner really does weigh heavily on how simple it can be. And the simplicity, I would say, comes from a couple of things. So first of all is the technology. So making sure that the technology you choose covers all of your business's requirements. And fundamentally, the main requirement that I would look to is, does it capture the data that you need to match your global business's requirements, if that's, emission standards, safety. So being clear up front what you want to do. Within the technology, it's also important to have the flexibility so that your local businesses can modify and adapt within their local environment. So that might be that in the UK, there's a particular emphasis for your business on wearing a seatbelt, whereas in Russia, speeding might be a larger problem for those niche things, as well as local requirements around data privacy. And then the other side of the coin is having a very strong global network operationally. So with telematics comes the need to have a box in the vehicle. So while a telematics provider like Geotab has a very big emphasis on the ecosystem, which I mentioned before, so making sure we can get data from as many OEMs as possible to remove that complexity. In the short term, you need to be able to get boxes in vehicles in the UK, as well as Ukraine and Russia and Poland and all of the other countries you're operating in. So it's very important to test the supplier on that front and see how simple they can help you make it to implement operationally.
Okay, good. Yves, we did not really talk about the transition from fleet to mobility, but we have in our survey, I know that already also some nice elements around mobility and what global fleet managers are thinking about the future of mobility and how to adopt certain mobility solutions. Now we have seen that the complexity of processes, transparency in data is one of the main obstacles, or are the main obstacles, let's say, to go global. Now, how do you see that then in the transition from fleet to mobility? Because it seems that it will only become even more hard for the fleet manager to align all the data.
Yeah, I was very happy when I read the total all the results of the survey, because what comes back most often is the importance of savings, and I think that the pandemic is going to reinforce that message. And now what I do see is that across the responses of the survey participants, they look at their OEMs and they look at their leasing companies to generate savings for them. But I think that the reality and the true potential of savings is nowadays in utilization of the vehicles, right? We have alternatives, then we have an alternative to a kilometer. And that is really important, is a really crucial thing, because, you know, I think if we would ask the question to Yulia, that she would say that, you know, the additional savings of an OEM tender are, you know, they're there, but they're limited. We're not talking 10 or 20% on the total TCO. The true savings potential is in utilization and managing utilization. Now, how do we get there? And this is where mobility can give you an answer, right? Mobility can replace not all the professional kilometers, but mobility can replace a number of professional kilometers. Can do it in a green way, in a CO2 friendly way, can do it in a cost efficient way, and can even generate savings compared to a car, right? So this is where we start. So I think there is going to be a push towards mobility, and that push is not going to be driven by ideologies or, you know, sharing industry. That push is going to be driven by procurement and, you know, in general, companies wanting to realize savings in the most, you know, in the most efficient way. So there we go. I think mobility is in a good place. The second thing that you were asking, I think, is about the transition from fleet to mobility. And, you know, obviously the solution transition is in HR, as a benefit, as a business continuity question, so sits more on the policy level. But from a process point of view, we're talking again about the transition from analog to digital. Right. Fleet management today, pretty simple. I'm exaggerating here, right? But pretty simple. You've got your invoice for the car, you've got the invoice for the fuel, and if from the insurance company, if you haven't bundled, so 3 invoices per vehicle. In mobility, you'll have probably more than 3 invoices or 3 transactions a day per employee. Right. So this is where the true difficulty lays of, you know, a transition from fleet to mobility. It's not just a policy thing, it's also a process thing. This is why, you know, talking about connector now for a second, this is why we are focusing really strongly on that, you know, on those 2 pillars. Make sure that you find the right suppliers, and they might not all be there right now in each country. But for 2, make sure that you automate your processes, that you don't have, you know, a girl or a guy sitting behind an Excel sheet and allocating things to the correct tax buckets, right? So yeah, this is very positive about mobility, but we need to get through the complexity.
Okay. The final questions are for the global fleet managers. Julia, we have seen already a slide about changing leasing providers. We also have in the full results changing car manufacturers, for example. Would like to know what are for you main reasons to change supplier, a lease supplier, car manufacturer, insurance company? Is there a reason why you say this is something where I really would struggle with and see if there is another one to go for?
Yeah. I think that depends a little bit on a type of a supplier, because when you talk about the car manufacturer, of course, it's a more strategic decision when you also need to take into consideration the sustainability topic, you know, the development of the supplier together, how you want to live together further. When it comes to the leasing services, for me, it's more tactical approach because mainly it's linked with cost efficiency, like also Sven highlighted in the presentation, not only cost savings but also transparency, but also the service level, right? So these are the key elements which I take into consideration. And the one last, when it comes to mobility, when there is I mean, that goes from both ways, from top down and from bottom up, right? When you really need something new, the market would generate something new to you. And when you see that on the market there is something new, you will go for it. So if there is something really fancy and super cool, which is able to replace the fleet, we would be more than happy to go for it. Okay, thank you. Gavin, final question. How will the COVID-19 pandemic change your global fleet strategy?
That's a very good, relevant question, because we're in the process at the moment of tendering our manufacturers, and what we aren't going to see a massive change because of the virus, except in terms of replacement cycles may change slightly. In terms of leasing, we're not expecting a major change either in the moment of renegotiating with our leasing companies. What we may see is a slowdown in any change in terms of mobility. I think the things about car sharing, carpooling, I think that may be put on the back burner for a while. I don't think the virus is going to have a big change in our strategy. We're going to carry on as we are, and we're going to carry on making savings.
Okay, very good, because apparently indeed savings and cost efficiency is still paramount for many multinationals and the global fleet managers. And so I would like here to end this webinar. Thank you very much to our experts, to Sven, of course, for giving already the highlights, Yulia and Gavin as being the voice of the global fleet customer, and to our sponsors, Aaron of Geotab and Yves of Connector. Thank you. You see on the screen that there is a recorded version of this webinar that you can relive from tomorrow on. And so if you have further questions for the experts, you can do that via the Attendify app, the event app. And then next week, or let's say this week, because it's the final week, ladies and gentlemen. So tomorrow, after tomorrow, and on the 3rd of July, we still have some sessions. So we hope that you can stay until the 3rd of July when we end the first virtual global fleet conference. And as said at the beginning, there is a nice surprise for all the attendees and the participants of the global fleet conference. You can now order the Global Fleet Survey 2020 with all results and an analysis on our web shop, shopnexuscommunication.be, with a promotion code GFS_July 20%, and you will have 20% off. In there you will find all the results, and it's the ideal tool to benchmark your global strategy. Thanks to our sponsors, Volkswagen Financial Services, Volvo, Geotab, and Connector. And then finally, we are here with the global fleet community. Please also know that from now on, you can apply for the Global Fleet Manager of the Year award. So one of the most coveted industry awards that are around. And you can find that also on our website, globalfleet.com. So that is it for now. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.